You know that feeling, not quite loneliness, not quite sadness, but something in between the two when you are surrounded by people and somehow still feel like a stranger at your own table? Maybe it happens at a gathering where everyone is laughing and you are laughing too, but somewhere beneath the sound of your own voice, something small and quiet refuses to join. Or maybe it is the moment after a success when you finally got the praise, finally received the acknowledgement you had been quietly working toward, and you wait for the feeling that was supposed to follow, and it does not come. Not fully, not the way you imagined it would. If you have ever felt that disconnect, not dramatically, not in a way you could easily name or explain to anyone, then this video was made for you. Or because here is the question nobody ever asks out loud. What if the life you have been carefully constructing, approval by approval, performance by performance, is not actually yours? Why did Carl Jung say to focus only on yourself? Not to become selfish, not to become cold or indifferent, not to withdraw from the people who matter to you or the life you have built. But because Carl Jung, one of the most penetrating minds ever to study the human psyche, saw something in the architecture of modern life that most of us are simply too close to recognize. He saw that the vast majority of people are not living from the inside out. They are living from the outside in. And the cost of that inversion is not loud. It does not announce itself. It seeps in slowly, quietly across years and decades, until one day you find yourself wondering why you feel so far from yourself in a life that appears, by every visible measure, to be going exactly as planned. That gap between the life that looks right and the life that feels true is where this conversation begins. This is not a video about productivity, habits, or morning routines. There are no checklists here and no affirmations to recite before bed. What we are going to do is go somewhere considerably deeper. We are going to trace step by step, layer by layer, the psychological journey from a life organized almost entirely around the world's response to finding what Jung called the inner center, the place in you that does not need the world's permission to know that it is real. That journey has 7 distinct stages, and by the time we have traveled through all of them, something will have shifted. Not explosively, Jung was always skeptical of explosive transformations, which he tended to see as the ego performing awakening rather than actually undergoing it, but genuinely, quietly, in the direction of what has always been true about you. Stay with this, because what Jung spent a lifetime uncovering is not always comfortable knowledge, but it is the kind that, once you have it, changes the quality of everything else. Think about the last time someone paid you a genuine compliment. A real one, specific, unexpected, from someone whose opinion you respect. Do you remember how it felt? That small but unmistakable lift in the chest. The way the rest of the day seemed slightly lighter, more possible. Now think about the other side. A silence where you expected acknowledgement. In an ambiguous response where you hoped for warmth. A lack of reaction where you had quietly invested something real. The gap between those two experiences, that pendulum swing between rising and falling, based on how the world responds to you, is exactly where this conversation begins. There is a line that has stayed with me for years, one of the most famous Carl Jung quotes on self-discovery he ever offered. He wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What he meant translated into the ordinary texture of daily experience is this. Most of the forces shaping how you move through the world are operating below the level of your awareness. You don't choose to feel validated by praise or deflated by silence. It simply happens. And because it happens automatically, invisibly, and it feels like the natural order of things, like the weather, like gravity, like just the way life is. But Jung didn't see it as fate. He saw it as a stage, a developmental stage that most people enter early in life, and unless something genuinely intervenes, never consciously examine or exit. Here is what that stage looks like from the inside. You work hard, genuinely hard, but somewhere inside, the motivation is never purely about the work itself. There is always a second current running beneath the first. A quiet monitoring. Am I being seen? Is this good enough? Will this be recognized? You make choices about your career, your lifestyle, your relationships, even your opinions, and they feel like your choices. But when you trace them back carefully and honestly, many of them were made less from inner conviction than from the need to appear a certain way, to belong, to stay within the edges of what the people around you have agreed to call acceptable. And the tricky part is that this doesn't feel like inauthenticity. It feels like being a reasonable, functional adult. Jung had a precise image for what is happening in this state. He called it living by the collective map. When you do not yet have a strong enough inner sense of who you are and what genuinely matters to you, you borrow the map that everyone around you is using. You follow the same roads, aim for the same destinations, measure progress by the same milestones. Not because these are necessarily wrong roads, but because you are following them by default rather than by genuine inner choice. And this produces something over time that is very difficult to name from inside it. A man I want to tell you about, let's call him David, was in his early 30s, and by every outward measure, was living exactly as a man his age was supposed to live. Good career, well regarded in his field, a full enough social life. But David had a quiet crisis that was hard to describe to anyone who hadn't felt it. When he was busy, really busy, he felt fine. Purposeful, even. But on the rare occasions when no one needed anything from him and no one was watching, something surfaced that he didn't know what to do with. A deep, unlocatable emptiness. Not sadness exactly, but a feeling of distance, as if he were watching his own life from slightly too far away. He didn't tell anyone about it. Because it wasn't dramatic enough to count as a real problem, so he just stayed busy. This is what Jung called alienation. Not about having done something wrong, not about being morally compromised. Alienation is the condition of living increasingly far from your true self, while simultaneously believing that you are living perfectly normally. You are doing everything right. And that is precisely the problem, because right is defined entirely by the world outside you. And the world outside you does not know who you are. The first whisper of restlessness, that faint, difficult to name feeling David carried, is not a warning that you are failing. From Jung's perspective, it is the first honest thing your inner life has communicated in a very long time. Something in you is beginning to refuse, and that refusal is not breakdown. It is the very beginning of becoming. Once you understand that you have been navigating by a collective map, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who exactly has been showing up in your name while that navigation was happening? Jung had a very precise name for this. He called it the persona. The word comes from the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theater, worn to indicate which role they were playing. Jung borrowed it deliberately because he wanted to convey that the persona is always at its core a performance, not in a cynical or dishonest sense. The persona is a sophisticated act of social intelligence. It is the set of attitudes and self-presentations we learn often very early, before we have words for what we are learning in order to navigate the human world successfully. To be accepted, to belong, to avoid the particular pain of exclusion. The persona was never your enemy. It helped you survive. The problem begins at a very specific moment, the moment when you forget that it is a role and start to believe that it is you. Think about how this happens. You discover early on through the visible reactions of parents, teachers, peers that certain versions of you are welcomed and certain versions create friction. The curious, questioning child learns to be less questioning. The intensely feeling teenager learns to be more measured. The ambitious young adult learns to package ambition in the socially acceptable language of collaboration. None of these adjustments are lies exactly, but each one is a small migration of the self, away from inner truth and towards social viability. Over years, these small migrations accumulate into a personality that is, in many respects, a carefully curated performance. One that you have been giving for so long that the performance and the performer have become nearly indistinguishable even to you. Jung put it with characteristic precision. The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. The persona is what you think you are. It is what others think you are, but it is not what you actually are. And the distance between those two things is where the deepest exhaustion lives. I want to tell you about someone I'll call Maya. She worked in a creative industry and was, by the assessment of everyone around her, exceptional. She always knew the right thing to say, navigated difficult conversations with grace, showed up consistently and impressively. Those around her described her as warm, professional, perfectly suited to every situation. And in a private conversation, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, "I don't know what I actually enjoy anymore. Not in the deep sense. I know what I'm good at and what people appreciate me for. But what I would choose freely, with no one watching, I genuinely cannot answer that." She was not in crisis. She was performing extraordinarily well. That was the crisis. The persona had expanded to fill the entire available interior space. And somewhere in that expansion, the person it was supposed to protect had gone very quiet. The anxiety that arises when you imagine stepping outside that mask, allowing others to see a part of you that doesn't fit. The polished image is not a warning to stop. Jung was very direct about this. That specific unease, the discomfort of loosening a long familiar performance, is the sensation of genuine contact with something real. It is the authentic self pressing, quietly but persistently, against the walls that have been built around it. You don't need to tear the mask away all at once, but you do need to begin noticing when the mask is governing your inner life, when you are deciding how to feel based on whether the performance has been applauded. When the persona is no longer a tool you are using, but a warden managing your access to your own experience. That noticing honest and without self-judgment is where everything begins to shift. There is a particular trap that opens once you begin to loosen the mask, even slightly. You stop performing quite as relentlessly for others. You become a little more inward, a little more deliberate, and then almost immediately a different mechanism activates. You look sideways. You look at where other people are, what they have achieved, what stage of life they appear to have reached, and you begin, almost involuntarily, to measure. Carl Jung individuation, the complete lifelong process of becoming fully and specifically yourself, is designed in direct opposition to this reflex. Because comparison, as Jung understood it, is not merely a habit of envy or insecurity. It is something far more structurally damaging. It is the act of invalidating your own developmental process by holding it against someone else's. Jung believed that no two human beings share an identical process of psychological development. Every person carries a unique interior structure, in a unique rhythm of maturation, a unique sequence of necessary experiences that is as individual as their fingerprints. The path that is right for you, the pace, the particular detours, the apparent failures that turn out to be the most essential periods, cannot look like anyone else's path. Society, however, does not operate by that logic. It creates shared timelines. By this age, you should have achieved this. By this point, you should have arrived at that. These timelines are not malicious. They are the inevitable product of a culture that needs to organize millions of individual lives into a coherent collective narrative. But when you internalize those timelines as the actual measure of your own progress, you stop listening to your interior process entirely. When you force your psyche to follow a schedule that was never calibrated to its specific needs. Jung did not call this ambition, he called it misdirection. There is a man whose story I find deeply worth understanding. Let's call him Marcus. For many years, Marcus moved through life with a persistent low-grade conviction that he was behind. Behind peers who seemed to have landed more decisively, more securely, more impressively. Every social gathering became a quiet assessment. Where are they? Where am I? And the verdict was almost always the same. Not enough. Still catching up. But during a period of genuine difficulty that forced him to stop, he made a discovery he would later describe as the most important of his life. He had not been lost. He had been walking a different path, slower by every social measure, but considerably deeper in ways the social measures couldn't detect. The phases he had experienced as failure were not deviations from a correct path. They were the path, his path. The moment he stopped comparing was not the moment he caught up. It was the moment he came back to himself. In Greek mythology, Achilles is the greatest warrior of his age, invulnerable in every part of his body but one, and he remains protected as long as he lives in alignment with his own destiny. When he steps outside that alignment to chase others' definitions of glory, to prove himself by someone else's measure, he exposes his only vulnerable point. Through a Jungian lens, the heel is not a physical defect. It is the self, abandoned in pursuit of external validation. When the question that begins to free you from comparison is not where am I compared to them, it is considerably quieter and considerably more demanding. Am I aligned with myself? That question doesn't always produce a flattering answer, but it produces a true one. And a true answer, even an uncomfortable one, gives you something solid to stand on. Comparison never does. Now we go deeper, and this is the layer that most people never reach because it requires a kind of honesty that feels, at first, very much like going the wrong direction. You have loosened the mask. You have stepped back from comparison. And yet the fear of judgment has not disappeared. A certain glance, an ambiguous comment, a pause in a conversation, these still land with unusual force. One still produce that particular contraction that says, they are seeing something wrong in me. If you have ever wondered why the fear of being judged persists even after you have done everything you were supposed to do to address it, this section is specifically for you. Because what you may not yet know is that the fear of judgment, in most cases, is not actually about the world outside you. It is about something inside you that you have not yet been willing to look at directly. Jung called this mechanism projection, and it is one of the most important and least examined forces in the entire architecture of the human psyche. Here is how it works. Every person carries material within them that is too difficult to acknowledge directly. Feelings, self-perceptions that are too threatening to the image we have constructed of ourselves. These aspects don't disappear when we refuse to acknowledge them. They get displaced, attributed to the world outside us. We begin to perceive in others' expressions, tones, and reactions what is actually being generated from within. The inner critic that cannot be faced directly becomes the hostile gaze of the colleague. The self-doubt that has never been spoken aloud becomes the judgment you are absolutely certain others are forming. Everything that irritates us about others, Jung observed, can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When you apply that honestly to your own experience, a surprising and uncomfortable answer begins to emerge. The harshest judge in your life is not usually a specific person or group. It is a part of you that you have not yet given a name or a place. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Elena. She was capable and accomplished, but for years haunted by a persistent conviction that her colleagues didn't truly respect her. Every question felt like a test. Every piece of feedback landed as evidence of their low opinion. When Elena began to look not outward at her colleagues but inward at the belief she had been carrying for years, she found it almost immediately. Beneath all the outward competence, beneath the careful daily performance of capability, there was a voice that had been running continuously and had never once been directly addressed. That voice said, "I am not good enough, not loud, not dramatic, just constant." And because she could not accept that belief as something requiring healing rather than concealment, it had been flowing outward into the eyes of her colleagues, into the presumed tone of their feedback, and into the imagined meaning of their silences. When she began to acknowledge that belief, not to agree with it, but simply to see it clearly, something genuinely unexpected happened. Her colleagues didn't change. Their questions had the same structure. But the experience of receiving them was completely different, less threatening, more like information and less like verdict. The projection had been partially withdrawn. And from there, for the first time, it could be honestly addressed. Withdrawing projection requires the willingness to look at what you have been placing on the world and say, some of this belongs to me. What becomes available on the other side is something no amount of external reassurance can provide. When you stop needing the world to carry your unresolved interior material, the world loses its capacity to destabilize you at the deep level. You can receive criticism without collapsing beneath it. Not because you have become armored, but because the inner territory that was once outsourced has been genuinely reclaimed. There is a particular quality of quiet that descends when the mechanisms we have been tracing begin to loosen their grip. when the need for constant external confirmation softens, when the comparison fades, when the projections begin to return to their source, and in that quiet, something appears that many people have been unconsciously avoiding for years: solitude. I want to be precise about what solitude means here, because the word carries associations that can mislead. I am not talking about loneliness or isolation. Loneliness, as Jung understood it, when it is not produced by the absence of other people. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that seem genuinely important to you. You can be profoundly lonely in a room full of people if none of those people are meeting you at the level of what actually matters. What I am pointing toward is something different, a quality of genuine interior silence possible only when you are not for a moment performing for anyone, not reacting to anyone, not monitoring anyone's response to you. Simply present with your own experience without the constant social static that normally overlays it. For Jung, this kind of solitude was not a luxury or a personality preference. It was a developmental necessity, perhaps the only condition in which the deeper layers of the self can finally make themselves known. Think of a lake in the early morning, and when the wind is blowing, the surface is in constant motion, rippling, fragmenting, distorting everything beneath it. You cannot see the depth. Only when the wind subsides does the surface settle, and the stillness of the water reveals what has been present all along. Your inner life works the same way. When you are always reacting, always performing, always positioned in relation to someone else's expectations, you can only access the surface layers of yourself, the deeper currents, the quieter truths, the genuine preferences and genuine longings. These exist below the rippling surface. Silence does not create the authentic voice. It only creates the conditions in which that voice can finally be heard. In the early 1980s, Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple, the company he had founded. By every conventional measure, this was failure. But Jobs did something that in retrospect looks considerably less like defeat and more like a necessary psychological journey. He slowed down, radically. He traveled. He sat in silence. He meditated. He allowed himself to exist in the unfamiliar territory of not producing, not performing, not being publicly recognized. It was in that period in the space that opened after the noise of the fall that the ideas which would define his return took shape. Not competitive ideas driven by the need to prove something, the genuinely original ones. The obsession with simplicity, the understanding that design is philosophy made tangible. From a Jungian perspective, the self, the deep, genuine self that cannot operate under unrelenting external pressure, finally had room to speak. And what it had to say changed everything that followed. The fear most people carry around genuine solitude is not, when examined honestly, a fear of silence itself. It is a fear of what surfaces in silence. Avoided questions begin to press forward. Desires you have been too cautious to acknowledge. Grief you have been too functional to feel. These are not pleasant visitors, but Jung was unequivocal. Only what is faced can be integrated. Only what is integrated stops operating invisibly from beneath everything you do. The discomfort you feel when genuine solitude is near the impulse to reach for a phone, to fill the quiet with anything available, is not a signal to retreat. It is a signal that something real is very close, something that has been waiting with considerable patience for space. Something begins to happen, gradually and almost imperceptibly, nor when you have spent enough time in genuine solitude. something shifts in how you relate to your own actions. You begin to move differently, not because someone is watching, not because a specific reward is waiting, but because something inside some quiet, persistent inner sense of what is actually necessary is pointing in a specific direction. And you are learning, slowly but genuinely, to follow it. Jung made a distinction that is one of the most practically important ideas he ever articulated. He distinguished between two fundamentally different sources of human action. The first is what he called the extroverted ego, the part of you that acts in order to be seen, assessed favorably, recognized, and positioned well in relation to others. The extroverted ego can drive enormous quantities of productive activity, but the energy that powers it is fundamentally dependent on external feedback. When the feedback is positive, the energy rises. When it is absent or negative, the energy drops. It requires constant refueling from outside itself. The second source Jung called inner necessity. This is the experience of acting because something inside you demands that the action be taken regardless of whether anyone witnesses it, appreciates it, or even knows it is happening. It is the person who chooses integrity in a moment when dishonesty would be entirely undetected, simply because the alternative would mean a betrayal of something they are no longer willing to betray. The shoe that fits one person pinches another, Jung wrote. There is no universal recipe for a meaningful life. The formula that produces genuine energy for you will not produce it for someone else. And this means the only reliable compass, the only one that consistently points in a direction that is actually yours, is the one that operates from within. There is a man called Leon. He worked in finance, fast-paced, metric-driven, perpetually oriented toward external performance. After a period of genuine burnout, the kind that leaves you not just tired but hollowed out, he arrived at a crossroads. He made no dramatic changes, no public declarations. He began waking slightly earlier each morning to read things that genuinely moved something in him. He kept a small journal, writing a few honest lines each day with no audience. He identified the single most important task each day and gave it full attention before attending to anything else. None of this was announced, none of it discussed. No one praised him for it. But something changed. Gradually, undramatically, in the way genuine shifts in the self tend to announce themselves, he became calmer, more decisive, less easily swept off course by the emotional weather around him. He wasn't doing more than those around him, but what he was doing carried a weight and clarity that his previous, more frantic version of effort had never possessed. He hadn't become better than anyone. He had become more aligned with himself. And the external effectiveness that followed was a consequence of that alignment, not a goal being pursued. Think of a tree whose roots grow deep underground. The roots are not visible or impressive. No one photographs them or describes them in terms of achievement. Yet they are the entire reason the tree survives drought, survives storm, survives everything the surface cannot endure alone. What you are building when you commit to a disciplined inner life is that invisible root system. Not impressive from the outside, not easily shareable. But when conditions become genuinely difficult, and they will, you will know precisely what you built in the quiet. True growth, as Jung observed repeatedly, almost never resembles a breakthrough. It resembles, far more closely, a quiet accumulation. Each day slightly more faithful to the self. Each small promise kept to yourself in some moment no one will ever see, strengthening the interior axis that holds everything else. We have arrived at something that takes a particular kind of honesty to examine directly. You have built a more disciplined inner life. You have loosened the mask, stepped back from comparison, begun to reclaim what you had been projecting outward. You have learned something genuine about real solitude, and yet even now there is something subtle still operating. A quiet movement toward the world just around the edges of awareness. A wish for confirmation, a desire not dramatic, not desperate, but persistent to have someone acknowledge that what you are doing is right, that you are on the right path. If you recognize this in yourself right now, understand something clearly. This is not a failure. It is the final layer of a mechanism that has been operating since very early in your life. And what becomes available when it finally dissolves is unlike anything that precedes it. Jung described the development of the ego through several stages. When in the earlier stages, the ones most people unconsciously inhabit for much of their adult lives, the ego draws its sense of worth from external reflection. It needs to be seen in order to feel real. It needs praise in order to feel adequate. The ego at this stage is, in a precise sense, externally regulated. Even when it appears strong and self-sufficient on the surface, its actual foundation is outside rather than inside itself. As the ego matures through experience, through difficulty, through the inner work we have been tracing throughout this conversation, it begins to discover a different foundation. Jung called this inner unity the condition in which what you think, what you feel, and what you do are no longer in significant conflict with one another. When the gap between the performed self and the actual self has narrowed to something you can honestly inhabit, at that point, the need for external validation doesn't disappear because you have suppressed it or disciplined yourself out of it. It dissolves because the function it was serving has been replaced by something more stable. You don't need the world to tell you that you are okay, because the inner sense of coherence, that quiet but unmistakable feeling of alignment with yourself, is already providing that information, directly, without middlemen. There was a woman whose story I have thought about many times. Her name was Anna. She had done significant inner work, no longer running the comparison mechanism, no longer living through the persona. She had a genuine, regular relationship with her own interior life. But whenever she shared something personally meaningful, something she had created or decided, a small, almost imperceptible movement would occur within her. A checking, an orientation toward the outside. Not anxious, not desperate, but real. She was still asking, just below the level of full awareness, is this good enough? Does this merit recognition? When she finally noticed this movement and made the choice to redirect her attention back to the inner experience of the work itself rather than the anticipation of its reception, something shifted that was quiet but entirely permanent. Her emotional life changed. The rising and falling with others' responses, which she had not even recognized as constant until it stopped, went quiet. What remained was the work and the inner experience of doing it, wherein a quality of freedom she had not previously known was available. She did not lose motivation. She lost dependence. That distinction is everything. The most difficult thing to accept, Jung wrote, is oneself completely. Accepting yourself completely means no longer needing anyone else to bear witness to your value. The inner sense of coherence becomes sufficient. Not because you don't care about others or don't desire connection in the ordinary human way, but because the center of your emotional life is no longer located in their response to you. Imagine psychic energy as water. When you are still seeking validation, a steady current flows outward, spreading thin, always partially absent, waiting to return in the form of acknowledgement. When that energy is withdrawn inward, it seeps down. It nourishes the roots. The tree does not display its moisture. But when drought arrives, the depth of those hidden reserves is the only thing that matters. This is what withdrawing energy from the world actually means. Not coldness, not the rejection of relationship or community. The quiet, genuine shift of the center of your emotional life from the world's response to your own inner coherence. And when that shift completes gradually, through exactly the kind of accumulation we have been tracing, you find yourself in a relationship with life that is qualitatively different from anything that came before. We have traveled a long way together, and I want to take a moment here before we arrive at the end to name what this journey has actually been, because I don't think it was quite what it appeared to be on the surface, and I think that matters. Giovanni, we began with a question. Why did Carl Jung say to focus only on yourself? What we have actually been doing through each of these 7 sections is tracing a single continuous movement. The movement of the self, yourself, from outside to inside. From a life organized primarily around the world's response to a life organized primarily around inner coherence. We traced it through the external gaze and the discovery that the compass you have been using was borrowed. Through the persona and the recognition that the mask, however skillfully worn, is not the face. Through comparison and the understanding that the race you have been running was never on your course. Through projection and the courage required to see what you have been placing on the world that actually belongs to you, or through solitude and the revelation of what becomes visible when the surface finally settles. Through the disciplined inner life and the discovery of a faithfulness that asks for no audience. And finally, through the withdrawal of energy from validation and the arrival at a foundation that the world's opinion can no longer fundamentally reach. These are not 7 separate lessons. They are 7 layers of the same truth. The truth that the deepest act of genuine self-focus is not a retreat from life. It is the only path into a life that is fully, genuinely, irreversibly yours. Something has already shifted in you, not dramatically, but genuinely, quietly, at the level where genuine shifts occur. The image I want to leave you with is this. There is a version of you, not a better version, not a corrected or improved version, but the most complete version that has been present beneath everything you have been performing and chasing and maintaining. This version of you does not need the world to confirm its worth. It does not need a specific external outcome to justify its existence. It moves through the world not with the constant low-level anxiety of someone always checking their position against everyone else's, but with the particular quality of someone who knows not intellectually, but in the body, in the bones, where they are going and why. This version of you has always been there. What the journey we have been on together, what Jung's entire life's work ultimately was pointing toward, is simply the gradual, patient removal of what has been placed over it. The masks, the borrowed maps, the races run on other people's courses. Weigh the projections that turn the world into an echo chamber of your own unacknowledged fears. the dependence on feedback that kept your inner life perpetually outsourced. All of it not evil, not shameful, but simply not yours. And underneath all of it, you, the person who has their own rhythm, their own genuine curiosities, their own particular way of experiencing the world that does not need to be explained or justified or measured against anyone else's. The person for whom genuine solitude is not emptiness, but contact with something deep and real. The person whose discipline is faithfulness rather than force. The person who has learned slowly and through considerable difficulty that inner coherence is a more reliable foundation for a life than any amount of external validation. This is what Jung called individuation. The lifelong, a deeply personal, irreplaceable process of becoming fully and specifically yourself. Not a destination you arrive at and then possess. Not a peak you summit and photograph. A way of traveling, a quality of relationship with your own interior that, once genuinely established, changes the texture of everything it touches: your relationships, your work, your relationship with difficulty, your experience of completely ordinary days. It does not make life easier, necessarily. Jung never promised that. But there is a quality of difficulty that is sustainable and even generative because it is encountered from an authentic foundation. And there is a quality of difficulty that is simply exhausting because it is encountered while maintaining a performance you are not entirely certain is yours. The difference between those two experiences is not small, it is everything. What it feels like when you are genuinely living from your own center, when what you are doing is connected to what you actually are, is not the explosion of joy that certain voices promise. It is quieter than that, more durable. It feels like being in the right place in your own life. Not because everything is perfect, but because what you are doing is genuinely connected to what you actually are. Because the gap between the person the world sees and the person who lives in your own experience has narrowed to something you can honestly inhabit. That feeling quiet, requiring no audience, is what Jung spent a lifetime studying and pointing toward. Not as a luxury for the philosophically inclined, as the fundamental right of every human being. Know the right to live a life that genuinely belongs to you. To stop measuring yourself by standards that were never calibrated to your specific, unrepeatable existence. You have been on this journey longer than you realized. Everything that brought you to this video, every moment of restlessness, every instance of a life that fits correctly but doesn't quite feel like yours. Every time you felt something essential being covered over and wondered what was underneath was already the journey. Already the self making its patient case for your attention. The world is still there. People are still there. The relationships and responsibilities and realities of ordinary life are exactly as they were when you sat down. But something has changed in how you stand in relation to them. Was because the center from which you are meeting the world has shifted just slightly, just enough toward the inside. And from that place, the world loses the capacity to shake you at the root. It can still surprise you, challenge you, delight and grieve you in all the ways life has always done. But it cannot take you away from yourself, because you are no longer primarily located in its response to you. You are located at last in yourself. That is what it means to focus only on yourself. Not the small defensive version of that phrase. Not the self-protective withdrawal of someone guarding against further hurt. The large, courageous, generous version. The willingness to inhabit your own life so completely that you no longer need to borrow someone else's measure of it. That has always been available to you. It still is, right now. If something in this video landed in a place you do not quite have words for yet, if it touched a feeling you have been carrying for a long time without being able to name it, share it in the comments. Not because sharing it will produce a visible result immediately, but because naming a truth, even quietly, even imperfectly, is the first act of beginning to live by it. And sometimes a single honest sentence, written in the middle of an ordinary day, is the moment an entirely different quality of life begins. If you want to keep exploring this territory, subscribe and keep walking with us. Not to help you become a better version for the world, but to help you stop losing yourself within it.